yours.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for your introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. As mentioned, Climate Change has just released the 6th edition of the Global Synthesis Report on Climate Action, with a special feature this year, because instead of focusing on the climate action and evolution of GHG emissions of the last year, we tried to have a look back to where we were in Paris in 2015 and measure the progress that were made by non-state actors. This is building over the experience we've had over more than 6 years in analyzing non-state actors' contribution to the Paris Agreement, with many reports and contributions from experts and case studies on national level, local level, and multi-actor projects. So let's start with the bad news, guys. Sorry to say that, but emissions have hit a new record again. So this is the grim reality of global emissions of CO2. They raised by more than 7% since the Paris Agreement, of which 88% are from the combustion of fossil fuels, whose consumption has again reached a new high historically. We have never consumed as much fossil fuels as in 2022, and the record is likely to be broken again in 2023. This is true for oil, coal, and gas. But we cannot stop on that very, very bad reality at global level. So that's why the Observatory tries to go deeper at the national and non-state level in order to find out the signals and trends of transition that may make understand how can we abate those emissions. So if we take a look at the national level, we can see that there is a size of curve somehow between industrialized country and emerging country, with some industrialized country having already reached their peak in emissions. This includes the US, in a shaky way, European Union, as a confirmed trend since 1990, but also Japan more recently, or the United Kingdom that has nearly phased out coal from its electricity mix. In the other end, you have the emerging countries, the major Asian economy especially, that are rising their emissions high due to follow a development path, but also to answer the globalized economy demand for consumption and energy. If we take a look at those countries that managed to phase out coal, then we see that the decline of coal in the electricity mix benefits as much to gas as it does to renewables. This is true in the United Kingdom or in Spain, even in the US, despite a Trump mandate that was really favorable to coal. Coal consumption in the electricity mix decreased by nearly 50% in the US. But as you can see with the green color curve, that the gas in the electricity mix is also rising a lot, and although it is twice less emissive than coal, it is still a fossil fuel energy that I'd say block the system into fossil dependency. But also you can see at the top of the figures that hydro, wind and solar are increasing depending on the countries, especially in also biomass in some cases, which are good signs of transitions. Now, I'd like to make a stop at the actor level, because we will talk a lot about companies, but also local government and civil society role in the accountability system. What I've presented can feed the need to assess the progress from national government as part of the GST. As you know, the UNFCCC does not assess the individual progress of each state. It does so at a collective level. So this is our role as an independent NGO to also try to provide information at a country-based level, but also at an actor-based level. So I'd like to invite you to take a look at the report so that you can see more detail about this very rapid introduction that I've done of emissions in the energy mix at national level. So now let's take a look at companies' contribution to emission reductions. There are 3 ways a company can commit to mitigation targets. First, by measuring its emissions and reporting it publicly. You can see there has been progress over the years in terms of reporting of emissions, mainly focused on operational emissions, which include Scope 1 and 2, while 75% of emissions of companies in average come from Scope 3, which is still very weak, which means that companies find some obstacles to measure the emissions coming from their value chain. Another positive sign was that more and more companies have seen their target validated by independent bodies such as the SBTi, with now more than 2,000 emission reduction targets that were validated. It was in 2022, and the momentum is increasing a lot, out of 4,000 and more companies, which means that there is a willingness to make external analysis of the quality and credibility of the targets. But this is only about targets. It means that you have the compass, but you don't necessarily have the map. You don't really know how to reach your point. So this is what the CDP tried to look at, along with World Benchmarking Alliance, by implementing the ACT methodology that was developed in 2015, I think. Now more than 420 companies got assessed by, and I won't encroach on your speech, Joachim, but the good way with this work is that we can understand that companies' transition plans still lack of credibility. And as you can see, the figures are not really good, which means that there is still a lot of improvement to get to fix those targets upon sectorial-based scenarios, also provide the good fundings, and also to improve the governance of these transition plans. Why is it important that companies are holding accountable for their commitments? It's not only a moral question, it's also a matter of regulations and a matter of civil society mobilization. As you know, over the years, there's been, especially since COP26, new regulations coming in with the ISSB at international level from a private organization, or the CSRD at the European level. What I mean is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive at the European level, or even the SEC, that is the financial authority in the US, are asking companies to report better their emissions so that they can be holding not only accountable for their commitments, but also to provide the data to the financial actors so that they can make the proper decision and find the best way to make green investment. Another trend we've observed is shareholder activism that has raised over the year, and these figures are coming from the ADEME report, along with the Forum pour l'investissement responsable, the Forum for Responsible Investment, which assessed last year the impact of resolutions that were made by shareholders during a General Assembly's meeting of companies. You can see that most of resolutions are not adopted when they are submitted to vote during the meetings, but when an agreement is found with the board before the meeting, what we call a say on climate, that is, the resolution is carried by the board, then it can lead to huge rates of approval to push the company to better measure emissions, to improve the transition plan, to improve the targets, and to be more ambitious. And third trend we would like to stress on is the litigation, and thanks to the figures of the Grantham Research Institute, we can understand now that more and more litigation, climate litigation, is leading to victory for the complainers because of the judgment that were made in tribunals that were led, like the Urgewald against the Netherlands states, for instance, a couple of years ago. That was a landmark decision. But also now, this is not only states that are targeted by these decisions, these are also companies which are asked to improve their commitments and improve their transparency so that they can be more ambitious and respect their targets. So this is a new way to find companies accountable in terms of climate commitments, and this movement is especially focused on the global north companies, obviously, which are the most emitting countries. And finally, I'd like to end, because we tend very often to speak about companies, but I like also to stress, and I again invite you to reach the report to find more detail about that accountability is also a matter for cities and local governments, because the elected people are also embracing the net zero wave, the net zero groundswell, and they need now to deliver results that prove that they are on the right track to their targets. Many cities have committed to international cooperative initiatives such as the Global Covenant of Mayors or the C40. They are also delivering ambitious targets on renewable policies, but very few are actually reporting their results in such a way that we can track their results. That's what we saw through CDP Clay Track platform. So there is currently a lack of data that allows us to assess, to aggregate and assess the contribution of cities to these targets. And finally, my last point is there is a data challenge that we need to overcome. Underreporting of emissions. Satellite observations have shown that some cities tend to underestimate their emissions. The boundary issue, Scope 3, is a huge matter for cities when it comes to the frontier. And the time lag issue, we need regular emission inventories so that the policymaker is well informed when it comes to making a policy, but also for us, the researcher community, so that we can assess the progress that we made since the Paris Agreement. I'm done here. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Antoine. And I think it's very important that you bring indeed the city level ambition in there as well, because we often hear that it is sometimes challenging on a global level. So then also looking into country, subnational, and even city level, where the ambition sometimes precedes some of the global level ambition. So thank you for that, and I hope that we are able to unpack that a little bit further. As you mentioned, you already alluded to some of the work that Joachim has done. Joachim, you're the climate policy lead at World Benchmarking Alliance. You've been very much involved with the Climate Action Network to really look at what does non-state actor accountability look like, and how do we really assess this, both from a company perspective as well as from an initiative perspective. And you have come up with a report and some recommendations as well to the UNFCCC. So over to you for your presentation and your insights, please.
Thank you, Vicky. Okay, so I'll just start by giving a bit of an overview of what we do at WBA, who we are, and what our work has been on non-state actor accountability. So we're an international NGO which assesses how keystone companies, so the largest companies, those with the most economic weight through their value chain, revenues, how they are aligning with the SDGs in general. In the climate and energy team, we look specifically both at how these companies are developing credible low-carbon transition plans, so what is their decarbonization strategy, but also at the social impact that they have on workers, communities, and suppliers through social and just transition methodology. So we assessed a number of sectors. So the ACT methodology was co-developed with ADEME, French Environment Agency, and CDP. So you have here the sectors that I've been mentioning. And we recently released our latest iteration of our electric utilities benchmark as well. And really the idea is that we can see how credible are these transition plans, which look both quantitatively at how companies are aligning with a low carbon pathway. So we use the IEA's net zero pathway that we then translate at a company level, but also other aspects such as the level of expertise at the management level, supplier engagement, and also, as I was saying, on just transition. So I won't go into all the details of this because we released also a corporate accountability white paper this year, which sets a bit our view on corporate accountability. And essentially, there's no one size fits all. There's no single view of what corporate accountability is. But we drafted this paper also to show that there are currently a number of gaps in addressing corporate accountability. So it starts with the global agendas, how it's defined also in the UN level as well. But we see that there is a number of gaps here, both in terms of the data and the methodologies used, for example, on how to report Scope 3, whether we're talking about the interoperability of the standards that I can get back into, but also the actions that governments or civil society are taking and why it's not yet consequential enough for companies. So I'll focus actually on this last part for my presentation. So as Vicky was saying, this year we've collaborated with the Climate Action Network. We basically wanted to look more at what is the state of play, a little bit of non-state actor accountability. So to get to sort of rewind back a little bit, non-state actor accountability is not technically within the UN's mandates. It was really initiated with the Lima Paris Action Agenda that then became the Marrakesh Partnership for Climate Action. And the idea was to increase collaboration between companies and governments on mitigation, adaptation, and non-state actor accountability more generally. We now have, which is maybe emblematic of this, the Race to Zero and a number of climate initiatives seeking to drive net zero accountability, even though our transition plan has become more and more mainstream. And there's thousands of initiatives that are listed there. So our idea was really to break this down to assess 20 initiatives and companies. We picked sectors where there was compatibility with the initiatives, and I'll get into a second which initiatives. And we used the methodology we have at WBA, so the ACT and Just Transition methodology, and also the methodology of the Climate Action Network, to assess what are these initiatives actually doing. Because there's so many initiatives, it's getting really confusing. They sometimes have overlapping mandates. And the methodology of CAN is really looking more at the governance structure of the initiatives, how they're actually supporting their members. Is it inclusive? Is it just private sector? Or is there the view of civil society? And what is the objective of the initiative? Is it really specific, targeted about scaling renewable energy investment, or is it more broader? So that was the idea. This work is not representative of the whole race to zero, but our idea is to say that this could be scaled up and used as a kind of a template for, to assess more initiatives in the future. So this gives you an overview of the initiatives we've assessed. So there's a number of ones here you may recognize: EV 100, Renewable Energy 100s, the Just Transition Decent Job Pledge, and then these are the companies. So we've assessed them with our methodologies. We've done a number of interviews, and there's a couple of interesting insights, important insights that came through. So the first one of the insights is that these initiatives often serve as a way for companies to showcase efforts that happened prior to joining the initiative. So often they will take an initiative within a specific unit in that company. It can be decarbonizing steel, or it can be that there was a Just Transition action collaboration with the government. There was some interesting examples in Spain with Iberdrola as well. But the initiative itself is not necessarily driving forward the accountability of the company. The second point is that often companies join initiatives that are not directly relevant to reducing their emissions. So I'm not trying to downplay the role of the initiatives, but there were a number of electric utility companies or other companies that joined EV 100 when transport emissions represent a small share of the emissions. So again, why is that set that way in particular, and what is the value then of the initiative? We also found that the quality of the data, there wasn't basically a third-party accountability mechanism. And I think that's a key point in terms of how do we move more towards assessing the credibility of low-carbon transition plans and Just Transition, which is at the core of what this recognition and accountability framework is meant to do. Currently, these initiatives, there's the ACT initiative, but there's not a lot of initiatives that are talking actually about transition plans with tools to actually evaluate that. So I'll move on to the next slide. So our next step here was actually to ask, how can we map that in a way that will be useful for the UN as it tries to operationalize the recommendations, because this is a really special year. It's the first time that non-state actor accountability is so strong on the international agenda, with, of course, the H-like report and the recognition and accountability framework. So what we did is that we took the high-level expert group recommendations and the indicators that came from that report, and we mapped them to our ACT indicators. And there was actually quite a bit of overlap, about 65%, and we used I won't go into all the details, but we used a high threshold to determine if the companies that match, that perform well on the acting indicators are meeting the H-like criteria. So what you can see in the figure is that overwhelmingly, companies are struggling to meet the H-like criteria. A lot of companies are struggling to meet more than 30 or 40% of the H-like criteria. There's some, we could say, relatively speaking, better performers. Some of these companies have already transitioned. We know Ørsted. There's also EDP in Portugal and a number of others, mostly electric utility companies. And in the building sector, where there's complex value chains, and it's not clear whether it's the property developers, property managers, construction companies that are accountable, that's where we see the less compatibility with the H-like criteria. So about 70% of the companies were meeting less than 20% of H-like criteria. So what do we do with this data? It's not particularly positive. What we think would be interesting is that we have a lot of good practices already from companies that we've identified, and we hope that this work can actually sort of use the H-like criteria as a North Star moving forward, because there's so much commitments that are voluntary pledges, so much that there's been a lot of this already, and as I said, it's been good in building momentum, but moving forward, I think we should use this criteria and ask what are the specific barriers and enablers for these companies to address the H-like criteria. Okay, I'm going to move now to another insight from our assessment. Maybe you've noticed that the recognition and accountability framework does not mention so much Just Transition. It's very much on credible transition plans. So it's a good thing. We're very happy that the transition plan is mentioned, and we know we have a just transition work program that's being hardly negotiated at the moment. But what we see from our data is that actually companies that have already transitioned, say shifting from more polluting assets to cleaner assets, sometimes there's not necessarily, say, a responsible exit policy on who's going to purchase these assets afterwards, or there's no correlation necessarily. It's not the same that perform well in climate that will necessarily align with the just transition. And again, are we talking just about the workforce? Are we talking about local communities? So I think there is an opportunity to really weave in this just transition part in the recognition and accountability framework, and to have tools to evaluate and hold accountable companies on a just transition. And we actually saw there was not so many initiatives that explicitly mentioning just transition. So again, that would be also an area to reinforce. So to conclude, I'd say our recommendations for the recognition and accountability framework, but also for governments, because we have to remember the UN is not an implementation body. This is technically sitting, it's borderline in terms of its mandate. So we can have the best data in the world. There was a presentation this week with Al Gore and Climate Trace. The data is increasingly becoming better at an asset level and in terms of what we can measure. But even if JCAP through the NZDPU has this sort of granularity, and I don't think it will necessarily have asset level data, but if it shows the credibility of transition plans, then we need to implement these plans. So what this data should do, in our view, is that it should inform the next NDCs that will happen in 2025, so that we can make this link between the regulations that will be needed for companies and what we're seeing from non-state actors, so in our case, companies. So as an example, there's a number of mandatory disclosure standards that are occurring at the moment. Antoine just mentioned the EU, the US, and likely this is building up. So if this data is to be useful and not just a reporting in another framework, it has to feed into also some of these developments ideally, or at least inform these discussions. And also I think it's important to focus on companies, but our work with CAN has shown that we need to have some accountability of these initiatives. Otherwise, we're having siloed conversations, and I think that's problematic. Of course, it's important to increase the financial human resources of UNFCCC, and I'd say finally, it's important to ask why, when we looked at the Race to Zero and Global Climate Action Portal, there weren't so many actors from the Global South. And I think if the RAF is to be effective, it has to build a consensus from a number of parties. So of course, that's something I'm sure there's discussions around that, but what are the specific barriers, technical, financial, that are preventing these actors from participating? What is their view on accountability? So we need some more clarity on that. So yeah, I will stop here, and I will pass it over to Vicky again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joachim. And it was very interesting indeed to hear how you describe what is the role of the private sector in these global agendas, and how do we articulate better what that means in terms of holding them accountable through various initiatives. And one of the things that you touched upon was, of course, what's the role of finance? And there are, of course, various financial initiatives, and I would definitely now move to Raphael Lebel, who is the Director of Sustainable Finance. As you have been looking into what type of initiatives are out there, you have just released your Net Zero Donuts framework that will assess the alignment of the various financial frameworks, and we will try to, because there are a lot of abbreviations out here, so we try to explain them, and then hopefully that it's clear for everyone what we mean. But Raphael, you will go into what are the outcomes that you have seen in this assessment and in this framework, and also hopefully we can see some pathway that you've identified for improvement. So over to you, Raphael.
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you for the introduction, panelists, because but I think a good global view. Here we are going to more focus on the financial sector's contribution. So the Sustainable Finance Observatory has been launched in France for 4 years now, and the idea of this observatory is to have a tracking, a transparency on two kinds of data. The first one is the commitment taken by the financial actors. So we talk a lot about the importance to have transparency on the commitment, and to have like an history of the commitment which has been taken and where they are now, and to find a way to analyze this commitment and to see what their impact. So that's something we did for 4 years in France for the ESG commitment. So the commitment about environment, social and governance. And last week we start to focus on the net zero commitments, this commitment taken by the financial actor to be aligned net zero. And just so everybody got it in mind, today these net zero commitments, they represent 150,000 trillion of dollar in the world, which is like 40% of all the financial money in the world. So, and which is 2 times what we need to finance the global transition. So if we made these commitments net zero come true, that means we get here the money to finance the transition. So that's the first part, towards the commitment. And then we have another part is, with all this commitment taken, with all this money stopping to invest maybe in fossil fuels, financing the transition and financing the green things, do we have enough money to make in 10, 15 years an economy that is sustainable? Because just like the emission of today made the temperature in 10, 15, 20 years, the investment of today made the economy in 10, 15, 20 years. So that's why it's very important to have a dashboard to see what is going on. And that's why we push for years to make this dashboard not only for France, but abroad. And we were very happy this week to announce that this observatory will go abroad in a new foundation. And I will come back to that later. So the idea is really to have a dashboard to understand, compare, and track the contribution of financial actors by their own and in global to the transition. And maybe just to give an example, in the last year in France, the Financial Place, so led by, it's a private initiative, published their exposure on oil, coal, and gas using the Ordeval methodology you mentioned, Antoine. So this is one kind of voluntary approach, but on the main time it was only on stock and not on flows. So that means we know year to year how much there were still, but we don't know how much money which was adding every year or not, but still this is lack of transparency. So just to go on this net zero, I told you how much important this net zero can be to finance the transition. But the thing is, just what my colleague says before, today, can we know that when the financial actor says, yes, I will be net zero by 2050, is it going to be? So we try to think how we could have an indicators which track this commitment and all the parts. So what we analyze is that starting by the alliances, we figure out that it was like around 15, 20 guidelines, meaning maybe 40, 50 kind of indicators maximum. And so that's the alliances, that's the coalition of banks, coalition of insurers, coalition of asset owners, coalition of different capital investment, etc. And that's nice. It's, I have to say, it's a voluntary initiative. So we have to say it. But still, this voluntary initiative guideline wasn't even aligning the guideline of their global initiative, which is the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, so the initiative of the initiative. I hope I'm clear enough on this explanation. And what we saw at the end is that, okay, I see some people don't know. So we have like a lot of guidelines from different alliances. And what we see at the end is that even the members, when they publish their report, they don't follow the align of their the alliances they join. But so that's the first problem. The alliance, the guidelines of the alliance are not aligned. And the second problem is that it doesn't fit, but that we are missing a lot of indicators and guidelines in the framework. So the first things we did is that we looked at all the framework we found we thought was like hard as a work. And so we looked at even framework from a private sector as PCAF, we looked at ACT, some recommendations from WWF, of course the Ashleg, etc., SBTI. I'm not going to take them all, but so we looked at them all, and we had all the indicators which were missing to track this net zero commitment. And we made them aligning with the recommendation, with the framework of the net zero, so we can very easily compare them with the Net Zero Alliance's recommendation. We didn't make a brand new framework, so we can really easily compare them. Then we find a way to evaluate these indicators, because it's good to be transparent, but then we need to try to evaluate these indicators. And to be honest, at this stage, we could not make it for all today. We found out how to evaluate around 70% of the indicators of this commitment and resolution plan and transparency request. So that means we will still have to work, all together to have all the methodology ready to evaluate of the data, and maybe even to adapt years to years this evaluation. And with all that, what we do, we analyze the report of the banks, of the asset owners and the asset manager in France who did do this commitment and who did make this report the last years. And here's the result we found. So what we like is that with one view you can make a comparison if there is more green or red. It's quite easy. What we can see is that we have a lot of indicators, but we still have a global view which can give you an overall perspective, and you can make comparison that will not do in details. What you can do as well, you can not just check the data by alliances, but you can check the data by actors, and then we have new colors. As I told you, we don't have the evaluation for all the indicators, so we put them in purple, and sometimes we don't find the information, so that is wrong. So this is, we hope, a new indicators. You can watch by alliance deadline on your right, if I'm right. So that means it's without the indicator we had, just aligning with the deadline, are they aligned or not, or are they transparent or not, or you can watch as with all the indicators we had. Well, and yes, again, on the tool, of course, you can check one by one all the indicators, and all the database is free access. So, of course, it's open data, and of course, you can use as you want this data or the process to do it. Talking about the data a little bit, what we found out is that we found only almost 50% of this. Just talking about transparency, we found 50% of the data. And on this 50% we found, actually 50% was coming from regulatory data. And in France, we are quite in advance on regulatory, I would say. And so we are quite afraid that it will not that much abroad, and we hope we can do this study fastly. And at the end, we had only 70% of the indicators which were coming from the report, from the net zero report. So within that is the first problem. We should have much more transparency on this report. We want to celebrate some alliances. So the asset manager were good in the policies. We had a lot of indicators about how they are applying their pollution decision and the fossil phase out, for example. But again, we work a lot on that in France. So this result has to be just looked as for French result. The asset owners were better in regularity alignment and documentation, and again, because they had higher requests, so maybe that can explain. And we have to say that the French banks are very transparent and publish a lot of information, even if it's, well, not enough. Just at the end, you have like the percentage of compliance with the 5 pillars of the net zero transition plan, which is requested by the guideline, and you can see that we are at the maximum at the 30% of compliance. So there is a long way to do just to meet the requirement of the guideline. Maybe just it's hard to say to to have recommendation, because again, we are only on the French perspective, and we will need to have this study for a global perspective. But I would say the transparency is the key, and the transparency, not only the data, but the methodology used to publish the data. And behind how you calculate your scope 1, 2, 3 is even maybe more important than just publish your total emission. And that is exactly the same for the transition plan, etc. Follow the guideline would be the second maybe request. And to be clear on the coverage of your net zero plan. Because today we figure out that we have some communication on net zero plan, which concern maybe only 20 or 30% of the global activity of the financial player who claim to be net zero. And that's, we think it's a big way of improvement. Just to finish, I want to make a call for membership, because as we go abroad, we will be very happy to have more members to join, and it's absolutely free. The idea is to make a new governance which makes sense for this kind of observatory. So we have a call for scientific, for public authority, for civil society. We want to have the civil society in the governance, so they say which data they need in this kind of observatory. And of course, we make a call for companies, investors, financiers, and all other partners who think they have their role to play in such an observatory. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raphael, for this clear insight. And I think it is very interesting to see all these financial initiatives that are, quite celebrated, to bring together the financial institutions to see how can we push for ambition. But you've also made a clear case already on why accountability and transparency is needed in order to really show that these initiatives are credible and can hold up that integrity as well. Joachim already touched up on it a little bit in terms of not only addressing the transition plan from a decarbonization perspective, but also addressing human rights and looking into how can we make this transition a just one. But I think it is very timely now to move to Anne Barre. She's the coordinator for gender and climate policy for the Women Engaged for Common Future. And I think it would be very important that you highlight the need to look at the gender equation in this energy transition, but also if you can reflect on what you've already heard to see how can these commitments from corporates on net zero really integrate human rights and gender issues? Because I have a slight feeling that some of it is still lacking behind, but definitely interesting to hear more from you on this very important topic.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, I think you're very right. We are still lacking a lot of data. And from the presentation that I have just seen, I'm starting to understand why some parties don't want to see the word accountability in the global stocktake document. But I would say it is as important so much. So in WECF, I wear two hats actually today. I talk in the name of Women Engaged for a Common Future, an eco-feminist NGO that supports gender action on the ground, gender responsive action on the ground, and also is a founding member of the Women and Gender constituency. I am also a member of the board of Climate Chance. Why did I want to talk on gender in the energy transition? I think because probably it's where we have one of the biggest opportunities at the moment, and where it is really needed and also not yet supported enough in the negotiations. On data, why are data so important? Well, basically, if you take it at a very simple level, no data means no visibility. No visibility means you have no interest for the subject, and if there is no interest, then there is no action. And no action means also no accountability. Sometimes here we also see when there is actions or announcements, sometimes there can be also little accountability, but it's then even easier to not be accountable when you don't have data. So on gender, that is the situation we are facing. I think most of you probably don't know that among the 500 biggest companies of this world, less than 5% are women. You quoted the FTSC evaluation and board report from the UK. Among those top 100 companies there in the UK, only 8 CEO are women. When we look here at climate delegations, in most of the delegation, in average, we are between 30 and 40% of women delegates in one delegation. In some regions, it's rather at the level of 30%. And in terms of speaking time also, men still hold 65 to 70% of the speaking time. So, of course, we still have a long way to go. Also, in terms of data now, 77% of existing gender data are 10 years old. That's from the UNFCCC Secretariat report, Act on the Gap from 2021. And 84% of these data have only been produced once. It means they are not comparable. So you cannot make any comparison, you cannot make any serious evaluation of what's going on. In the energy sector, if we look at this specific sector, women represent around 35 to 37% of the staff, depending on which sector. It's a little bit less in the oil and gas industry, a bit more in the renewable energy sector, but still they are staff at the administrative level, far less in the upper management, also less in the technical engineer element of it. So when we looked at this report, because WECF was also involved in the CAN and WBA report, among the companies who were evaluated, less than 8%, or just 8%, I think, reported on having 30% women as managers. So it means the others have no report or not reporting. Also, what you can look at in a positive way is, in terms of criteria, would be the job creation. So some of them do report on parity or gender balance in job creation or in skills improvement. But rarely do you see that overall. So in the report, as we worked on it, basically what we can say is that gender data is mostly absent, or accountability and reporting on gender progress is mostly absent. So let's go quickly now on a type of where are the opportunities and the type of initiatives that we wanted to put forward in this report, and looking at other economic models like decentralized energy models that use, for example, the cooperative systems. You have a possibility to create more democratic, more socially just systems by looking at just participation, fair distribution of benefits and impact, fair energy markets, creating also community-based approaches. So community energy is, for example, in Europe, very trendy and really rising. In terms of economic situation, you look at well-being and planetary boundaries rather than profit, sustainable and just business model, diversity of actors. Looking at technologies, as I said, in the decentralization, there is a lot of opportunity for gender justice. Of course, in the renewable sector, in innovation, in accordance with social realities. So social innovation also brings a lot of opportunities. At the political level, I already explained that in some entrepreneurial models, you can have democratic, decentralized, participatory, and bottom-up decision-making and coherent frameworks. And finally, if you look at decentralized and local solutions, then integrated and involving different actors, you are going to look at trying to have no exploitation of humankind and nature, respecting planetary boundaries, etc. Which are today the gender barriers in the energy sector? Well, first of all, regulations. There is political inconsistency, political unwillingness to support gender-just energy communities, for example, and gender is not considered in energy policies, not in energy poverty policies, not in energy transition and entrepreneurial and job creation. In the personal sphere also. So there is a different perception of self-efficacy still. Socially shaped role models and education and tradition are not favorable for women in this sector. And so, as I already said, you have few women as board members. The financial barrier is very strong also. You still have a big gender pay gap, also in the energy sector. You'd have also less favorable financial situation for loans or for financial participation, accessing to financial support. And finally, there are a lot of structural barriers like time poverty, finances, decision-making, lower awareness of relevant energy networks, glass ceiling, etc., etc. My throat is a bit too dry. Excuse me. So, which are the gender tools that can be used? Well, we developed what we call the gender impact monitoring and assessment tool, where you can look at what gender data you have, or at least at the smaller level, more local level or group level, make gender analysis, look at target and indicators, do also gender trainings and women empowerment, communicate, and then go into policy advocacy. And finally, if we look at the global vision, because we are here in the global negotiations, from local to national and then international, it's important to create equal opportunities, so reduce these structural, financial, and personal barriers, give more power to actors and expertise, also increase the participation, the social acceptance and the trust in women as entrepreneurs in the energy sectors, for example, or as employees. Look at sustainability, for example, gender-just climate and energy policies. Finally, successful energy transition and go hand in hand with climate protection. So uptake of renewable energy and effective energy solutions have a wider scope. And in the transformation, because this is what we would like to hear also in the global stocktake, transformative policies, climate policies, you can alleviate poverty, you can create jobs, you can improve welfare, well-being, you can go into a more caring economy, and in the same time protect the climate and the planet. So these are opportunities that I hope will be well taken.
Thank you so much, Anne. I think it's very important that you zoomed in on this topic, because it shows how important it is to not look at it in silo, but as part of, you know, the affordable and clean energy, as well as the climate action SDG. We've talked a lot about the different initiatives and how they can serve or not to drive ambition, but one of the initiatives, if I can call it as such, that we are definitely here to celebrate is the one for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I'm very happy that we're joined by Rebecca, and congratulations so far on all the new signatories that you've received in the last days, weeks, and hope that you can elaborate a little bit on that for the audience here, but also how we can really push for accountability on an ambitious, funded phase-out of fossil fuels. So, Rebecca, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So as mentioned, I work for an organization that's focused on international governance on the production and supply of fossil fuels. So I'm going to focus on that a little bit, as well as some other accountability frameworks that are relevant for fossil fuel supply and production in particular, and then link that a little bit to COP28, where we all are right now. It maybe hasn't escaped your notice that fossil fuels is one of the contentious issues that's up for discussion here at COP, particularly in the global stocktake text. And that's because the Paris Agreement itself doesn't actually mention fossil fuels. In Glasgow, we had the first mention in a COP decision of fossil fuels, which referred to unabated coal power, and that was repeated last year. And so this year there's a live discussion around whether or not the text will go further in recognising the need to phase out all fossil fuels. And there are a bunch of reasons why this is important, so just to outline them quickly. Fossil fuels contribute 86% of the carbon dioxide emissions that are causing climate change. So theoretically, under the Paris Agreement, countries submit their NDCs, which they should ratchet up in terms of ambition every 5 years. And as a result of cutting emissions, you would expect you would see a fall in demand for fossil fuels and therefore a fall in supply. But unfortunately, that isn't what we're actually seeing in reality. So the UN Environment Programme has a production gap report that they put out every 2 years, and it shows that countries are planning to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels than would be consistent with the 1.5 degree temperature goal by 2030. This was the same number 2 years ago, so it hasn't changed. And countries are also planning on producing more fossil fuels than is consistent with their own NDCs. So there's a clear disconnect here between climate policy on the one hand and production policy. And this is a problem also because there's more fossil fuels in existing projects that are already being extracted than we can safely burn if we want to stay within the 1.5 degree temperature goal. And also because even though we have seen a massive scaling up of renewable energy globally, we've also seen a continued scaling up of fossil fuels. So in absolute terms, fossil fuels continues to increase, and in relative terms, it's essentially remained the same over the past decades. And we also heard from Antoine earlier about how, as we're scaling up, as we're phasing out coal, we're just seeing a transition to gas. So we're not actually successfully managing to shift the fossil fuels out of our energy system. Now, a number of highly respected international bodies have started to recognise the need to transition from fossil fuels. So we had the International Energy Agency's Net Zero Pathway a few years ago now, which recognised that to stay within 1.5 degrees, we can't afford any new fossil fuel projects. The IPCC and also the UNFCCC's own Global Stocktake Synthesis report also recognised the need to both ensure there are no new projects, but also begin to phase out fossil fuels. Now, obviously, I guess this is somewhat obvious, but why is accountability on fossil fuels important? There are a whole bunch of reasons. Firstly, you obviously can't manage what you can't measure. Also, right now, the Paris Agreement is structured around territorial emissions. So that means that accountability falls on countries for what they use in their territories. And you may guess from my accent, I'm from Australia. A country like Australia only has to account for the fossil fuels that we burn in our territory, not the fossil fuels we export overseas. And we are one of the largest fossil fuel exporters globally. Also, there's a serious equity consideration when it comes to the phase out of fossil fuels. So this slide here shows a correlation between those countries that are incredibly dependent on fossil fuels, but also have a low capacity to transition away. So these are the countries in the bottom right corner of the chart, like Iraq, the Congo, Timor-Leste, and countries that have a relatively low dependence on fossil fuels in terms of how much their economy relies on production, but also greater wealth, so greater capacity to transition. And that's countries like the US, Canada, Norway, and the UK. And so in order to create some kind of framework to enable an equitable phase out of fossil fuels, where countries that have the capacity to move first and fastest do, and those countries that need a little bit more support receive financial and technology and capacity building support and a little bit more time to transition, we need to know where production is happening and what that looks like. So I'm going to talk about a couple of accountability initiatives that exist that are helping us understand what's happening in terms of fossil fuel supply. So this is just a snapshot of the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels, which is an initiative that the Fossil Fuel Treaty helped work with Carbon Tracker on alongside Global Energy Monitor over the past few years. This is the first fully open source public database that tracks fossil fuel reserves and production in its CO2 equivalent. So instead of saying, X country produced so many barrels of oil per day, we can say they produced this amount of carbon dioxide equivalent in the oil that they extracted. And so this is all online, all open source, all completely publicly available data, and you can click into each country and understand what's happening in that country, and download the data and manipulate it yourself as well. And Carbon Tracker is beginning to start working with country governments as well to start thinking about how they can be reporting their fossil fuel production into a registry such as this, as opposed to only reporting their emissions, which they currently do under Paris. Another accountability instrument is the Fossil Fuel Policy Tracker. So this is another thing that we've worked on this time with the University of Sussex, which tracks where countries are implementing fossil fuel supply side policies. It also tracks divestment initiatives from non-state actors. And this particular tracker shows both where there are gaps in supply side policies, but also where there are some good news stories, so we can start to learn best practice. And so this is at fossilfueltracker.org. And then I also just wanted to touch on, before I move to the Fossil Fuel Treaty, I wanted to touch briefly on what's happening on accountability here at COP28. So some of you may be tracking what's happening in the global stocktake. I don't think there's any new text out. This was the latest iteration that I saw of the global stocktake text. And this is the particular paragraph. There's obviously, this is only a tiny snippet of a huge text, but this is the paragraph that's starting to talk about fossil fuel phase out. Now, I'm sure you're aware the global stocktake is the 5-yearly review of global progress towards tackling climate change. And the idea is it happens every 5 years, 2 years before countries are due to update their NDCs, so that countries can take the learnings from the global stocktake into their NDCs, ratchet up ambition, so that every 5 years we're getting increased ambition from countries with their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So the next round of NDCs will be 2025 to 2030. We also know from the IPCC that this is the critical decade for climate action. So if we want to turn the curve on greenhouse gas emissions and actually remain under 1.5 degrees, it needs to happen this decade, which means it needs to happen in the next round of NDCs, which means this global stocktake needs to talk about the things that countries should be putting in their NDCs in order to make ambitious enough commitments. So there's a really strong debate at the moment, which you may have heard on the floor of the plenary, about whether or not there should be a reference to the phase out of fossil fuels and what that looks like. Should there be a reference to unabated fossil fuels, which might allow, carbon capture and storage technologies, which are as yet unproven, to be kind of used as maybe a get out of jail free card and stop countries from committing to phase out commitments. And so this is, I think it's going to go really late into the evening tonight. I've heard that the plenary has been pushed back to 8:30, so it's kind of a live discussion at the moment. But I think really important to understand why recognition of the need to phase out fossil fuels should be accepted here at COP28. It was recognised in the synthesis report, and now countries are negotiating essentially whether or not they accept the findings of the global stocktake synthesis report and recognise it in the text. So finally, I'm just going to turn to my own initiative, which is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't have a slide on that, but I'll just tell you briefly what it is, because the idea of the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a complementary parallel agreement to the Paris Agreement. So I noted earlier the Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels. We're fighting here about whether or not we will mention fossil fuels in the global stocktake. The Paris Agreement is a consensus-based decision-making process, which means it ends up with a lowest common denominator decision. The idea of the Fossil Fuel Treaty is that it would complement Paris by focusing on the production and supply of fossil fuels. It wouldn't necessarily be a universal treaty, and it wouldn't necessarily sit under the UNFCCC. It could sit within the UN General Assembly or be a standalone mechanism with a critical mass of countries, but not all countries. Countries that are willing to actually commit to an ambitious, binding treaty that phases out fossil fuels, does so equitably, provides finance, and in so doing can then exert pressure through trade instruments, but also through diplomacy and reputational capital on the big producers that wouldn't be willing to make those commitments yet, but hopefully would be pressured to do so through the treaty instrument. And of course, by doing all of that, and by countries committing to phasing out fossil fuels, they then have an obligation to regulate the non-state actors within their territories, bringing it back to what we're talking about today in terms of accountability for non-state actors. At the moment, there's no need or responsibility or accountability on governments themselves when it comes to fossil fuel production, and so therefore it doesn't fall on corporates either. And so the idea is that through these many initiatives that I've mentioned, that we would start to see a framework that recognizes the need to phase out fossil fuels and that countries start to commit to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was very insightful. Also, where we are on the global stocktake, and we can unpack that a little bit more. I want to look in the audience because this was a lot of information that you've been absorbing. If there are any questions, and I see a hand up. I don't know how we do this. If there's a, great, there's a microphone that's coming your way. So if you could just please say your name very briefly and what organization or country you represent, that would help. And if there's anyone you want to direct your question to.
Well, thank you so much for this very interesting session. I'm Olivier from the Quebec Business Council on the Environment, a cross-sector organization in Quebec, Canada. I wanted to come back on the Integrity Matters report and the recommendation on regulating net zero commitments. Are you aware of any jurisdiction that are kind of moving that way into regulating net zero pledges? And if so, what kind of timeline are we talking about? What those regulations may look like, and should businesses advocate their local government to adopt such regulations?
I'll take one more question, please.
All right, thank you very much. This is Eric from Ministry of Local Government in Ghana. All right, that's so interesting in terms of the global stock taking and then phasing out and phasing down issue have come out strongly as per negotiation on that. What language do you think could be in the mouth, I say in the mouth of the CSOs, so also the non-state actors, of course, even state actors? What language do you think can we speak from here? Because it seems there's an objection as to whether we should go by phase out or phase down. But whichever way, I think that we should make some progress. And what do we have to talk about?
Thank you very much for that question. Maybe that last question, I think maybe the answer from Rebecca might be an easy one if it's phase down or phase out, but maybe you want to first reflect on what do you think the language in the global stocktake should be included in order to get those ambitious NDCs that we're looking for in 2025.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I should say there's been daily CSO coordination meetings debating exactly that question, and so it's not an easy one to answer because, well, I think at its core, ideally the language would be a phase out of fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner that's financed by developed countries and recognizing common but differentiated responsibilities. If that doesn't happen, if we have, for example, a phase out of unabated fossil fuels, there's a live debate around whether or not it's better to have phase out of unabated fossil fuels or phase down of fossil fuels without allowing that word unabated, which is currently undefined and potentially creates a lot of loopholes. I think the movement is leaning towards phase down of fossil fuels without that word unabated in it, and there's a really strong pushback against it. And I think the other thing to ensure that's there in the text is language around just and equitable and around developed countries taking the lead, because there are a lot of countries that are in the negotiations that are actually quite progressive and really willing to commit to fossil fuel phase out, but are in that dependent category that I showed on the chart earlier. And so are looking to see that they'll be provided a little bit of time and support so that they can make the transition. So for everyone to come to the table, that would need to be there as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was very insightful. And maybe because you say there's daily meetings by CSOs, maybe for the audience, if they want to follow the direction where it's go, do you have a recommendation on how people could get involved or follow the discussions?
Sure. I mean, if you're a member of CAN, the Climate Action Network, then there's a daily coordination meeting, same as the Global Gas and Oil Network. So if you are members of either of those networks, then you can reach out to your coordinator. If not, I'm happy to chat to you also about some of the discussions that are happening on text.
Thank you. That was not prepared as a promotion for Climate Action Network, but it turned out like that. So maybe then to the question on regulation, because I think it's a very important question. And I don't know, Antoine, do you want to take a first stab at how do we go about moving? You mentioned, regulation, litigation, shareholder action. how do we move in actually regulating these net zero transitions and the direction that we need to go? Also with the high-level expert group coming with the recommendations, there has been an announcement of a next step into the regulatory framework. So maybe you want to allude a little bit on that.
Yeah, you asked about a jurisdiction who would be able to right now regulate these net zero claims, and I think the European Union is first a good example because it is right now working on a green claim directive that would regulate not only net zero claim from companies, but also all sorts of claims that can lead to some confusion, like ethical or green or whatever. So there will be some guidelines so that you have to respect if you want to claim to be net zero. There's also debate about can net zero be applied at a product level or at an event level or a venue level. So this is a debate that is nearly scientific but also philosophical in a way, and this is my second point. We've seen lots of companies that are now shifting their net zero narrative because net zero implies some sort of use of carbon credits to offset the lasting emissions that you were not able to abate. And we see more and more companies that are not talking about a compensation, but about contribution now. So they say they pay for a project that helps to protect a carbon sink or to increase the capacity to absorb the carbon. But in the end, they do not claim the benefit of the carbon that was saved, and they give it to the hosting country, for instance, as part of Article 6. Or they just say, I did my contribution to the global net zero carbon neutrality. So there's a regulatory movement in Europe right now, but there's also movement at the level of non-state actors that are also realizing that there won't be enough of all carbon credits in the world to reach a net zero. So the first thing to do is to abate emission broadly, and then we'll speak about offset maybe.
And I think the other question was about advocacy. So I don't know if there's anyone here. Maybe Joachim, do you want to give your perspective on how we see, climate policy or friendly climate policy advocacy from the private sector in the help to move, the transition plans going forward?
Yeah, I think there are examples of companies that are sort of more progressive in advocating for, progressive climate policy. Maybe there's some examples as well. In the shipping sector, for example, where the IMO, International Maritime Organization, targets sort of lower than what some shipping companies have been pushing for. Similarly, there are companies that align with the IEA's expected investment needed in CapEx in the electric utility sector. So there are a number of examples of companies meeting these objectives that we could say that are sort of net zero lines. But what maybe is still missing, I think, because net zero is such a big issue and it impacts many things, is having this trickle down to national decarbonization strategies as well. I'm just taking the example of France, the country where I come from, where you have the national decarbonization strategy, and now we're talking about how do you plan the investments for that strategy on a longer term basis. So I think, yeah, there are examples for sure of companies that are advocating for change, and there's open letters that circulate about whether that's in certain countries, I don't want to name the country specifically, but where the investment environment has become less favorable towards clean energy investments, and even businesses are saying what's happening, we need some clarity in the policy environment. But also just wanted to highlight that the support of planification of the investments is also really important.
Yeah, thank you. And Raphael?
Yes, just to complete, and thank you very much for this question. I think it's very important. Yes, in Europe, we have the transition plan coming with a regulation for the enterprise and the financial actors, but we have some wall where it's not clear about the methodology, so maybe it will not be that much comparable, but we need to work on it. And for your question, shall we ask it? I would say yes. And on the other side of the Atlantic, we have another international standard working to define what should be the standardization of the extra financial data that is provided, which is a transition plan. And so far, it's not mandatory in this part of in the other side of the Atlantic. So, and with the IFRS, to be very clear. Yes, I think we really need to push for this transparency. We need to push it with an approach where we take the risk consideration from the climate on the enterprise and the risk that the enterprise made on the climate, which is a simple materiality and double materiality. We need to consider both. And one last thing to me, which is on transition plan or net zero plan, is we really need to be aware, and I'm sure you are going to be okay with me, of the carbon budget, which way you take to be net zero. I have an example very clear. When you go back home by plane, do you take one plane straight, or do you make a world tour for 2 years, taking 20 planes? And it's exactly that. Your transition to go back home, to go net zero, is it straight, and is it okay with the global emission we can do all over the world according to transition to the International Agency of Energy or the IPCC, etc., or is it not? And this is very important to take in account, I think.
Anne?
Yes, I just wanted to ask that, seeing the difficult discussions that we have today on phasing out fossil fuels, even though we know there is no other way, the just transition negotiations that have just started are even so more important, and we need to have a whole of society approach. So the gender just transition, energy transition is extremely important. So there also we need to have those criteria and the data that relies to it.
Yeah, I think that was one of my questions that I wrote down for you, Anne. How do you see currently that language being inserted, that equity consideration that you've alluded to in your presentation? Do you see that coming back in some of the proposed negotiation text, or are you hopeful that it will come?
There is a working group of the Women and Gender constituency working on just transition, indeed, and we also are asking for gender disaggregated data, gender responsive mitigation, not just adaptation and or loss and damage in the global stocktake. Also in the way forward and the guidance to the countries, we need there to have gender responsive reports using also the gender disaggregated data or the appropriate data that allow us to measure whether we're progressing on gender.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? I see a question on the left. I don't know where the microphone. Yeah, it's coming. And please state your name very briefly and your organization, please.
The mic.
Hi, Caitlin Hughes with Solar Cookers International. Thank you to all the panelists for a very informative presentation. And my question is for Anne along those lines. First of all, thank you for bringing up specifically the gender aspects. Can you share any positive examples? I know you work with some amazing, incredible women, so any positive examples?
We'll take one more question.
Oh,
otherwise
we have another question.
There's one more question, please.
Yeah. Michael Gillenwater from Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. For whoever wants to answer it, how are you addressing the fact that a lot of the fundamental accounting rules for what companies and other non-state actors are reporting are basically being rethought fundamentally at this time? So yeah, just the surface under which a lot of the accountability we're talking about here may change.
Okay, Anne, first question to you. Some inspiring stories about women.
Yeah, so from the side of WECF, we do work in many countries like Morocco, also Uganda, in creating energy cooperatives led by women, where they use different technologies, whether it be solar PV, or also thermo-solar technologies, biogas, but like small-scale biogas, and also in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. So there are extremely many countries where women are in charge of food transformation or any product transformation that actually still use fossil fuels. And there is no regulation, no support, no policies made to help these sectors make the transition. So indeed, those would be some examples. I think I also mentioned energy communities. I think that is also a very, very promising trend that could be replicated in many regions of the world. So.
Thank you. Maybe Antoine, to you, in terms of the question around fundamental accounting rules that are suggested that they need changing in order to really try to measure the accountability on this topic. Do you, first of all, agree? And if so, what's your outlook?
Yeah, I'm not so expert in the accounting methodologies per se, but for sure we see that the rules that make companies accountable, even at state level, I think about my example in France, we've seen that many companies, despite the mandatory reporting of their emissions, still not publish their inventory of GHG, and there is hardly no sanction. So you cannot make mandatory something that you do not punish somehow if you do not abide by the rules. So the first thing is you need really to be able to implement and enforce the law behind the mandatory thing. Otherwise, you would only rely on voluntary commitments, and that would not fit in. The second thing is most of the reporting landscape right now is built around the idea that the financial system is at risk if companies do not take in consideration the risk of climate change for their business model. And they hardly consider the fact that their business model can also be a risk for climate change. So this is the question of double materiality. And right now, I see that the voluntary landscape around reporting data is mostly considering that public data freely accessible is enough for the financial actors to take the decision then of their investment, and we celebrate transparency, and this is the end of the story. So I think that the framework that was proposed by the UNFCCC last June may be a good tool and a guideline to try to push towards more responsibility for those companies to not only deliver figures but also to show their progress and be able to evaluate their path for improvement in a practical way, because this is not what the current landscape is encouraging, I think.
I'm looking in the room. Are there any other questions from anyone?
Maybe I can just answer.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to answer that one quickly, I guess there's something that comes to mind is that there's also different methodologies and different ESG rating indexes and so on, and they don't necessarily always take into account scope 3, or the way they will rank companies based on the E, the S, and the G can sometimes lead to confusion. I mean, I don't know if that's still the case, but there was a point where you had Exxon or some fossil fuel producers that may appear as higher ranked than other companies. So how that's actually disclosed, in the transparency of the methodology is also important, and different categories in scope 3. So there's the whole emission inventory and the more technical aspects that are crucial, of course, but also as to how do you assess the credibility when we focus on company transition plans. And my colleague Romain in this room is leading a working group on that, because it's one thing to have all this data and to know that we need to assess the transition plans, but then if consultancies or assessors don't know how to assess the credibility or which factors should weight more or how to assess it concretely, that's also another really important aspect.
Thank you. And then maybe as a final round of questions to all the panelists, and Antoine, you already alluded a little bit to the framework, the Net Zero Recognition and Accountability Framework, or Roth in short, which had a sort of a public consultation, which is a framework by the UNFCCC to show how do we actually recognize and create accountability for transition plans and for delivering on the goals of the Paris Agreement. We've seen that there is some pushback or some delay on this. Could each of you reflect on what you hope that this framework will bring, and also what you hope that will be the recommendation in the end to the UNFCCC to really drive accountability forward? Antoine, can I start with you?
Okay, right. This framework is very important because constituencies, non-state constituencies, have been fighting for years to have their names only recognized or quoted once in the final declaration. And there's a lot to bet that there won't be any mention of local governments or companies or whatever civil society organization in the final declaration. So the RAF is not only an accountability tool, it's first a recognition tool. So it's a way to say to the states and to the national authorities, your non-state actors matter, and they need to be heard, but they also need to be accompanied and in the end monitored in their journey towards net zero and the way they commit to abate their emissions. So this framework is obviously a bit outpassing the mandate of the UNFCCC, which is state-driven. So obviously there are some states, I heard in June in Bonn that the United States, Saudi Arabia were not happy at all about this initiative from the Secretariat because this is leading to somehow recognize the importance of local governments and of companies, which some states are not ready to recognize as they are very centralized. And although the US is not centralized, it's still quite difficult. It's a matter of, of force. So this framework should not lead to any mandatory behavior in terms of transparency or reporting, but at least it should help to push the non-state actors issue on the table and try also to take a deeper look into their ability to at least track their progress. We don't ask for them to monitor or sanction, but at least to track the progress in a next post perspective, which is cruelly lacking right now in the landscape.
Thank you. Joachim?
Yeah, maybe just two reflections. One of them that I've touched on is that you can have the best disclosure framework, the best data in the world, but that data will not sort of take its legs to lead to implementation in of itself. So it's very welcome that we now have the Net Zero Policy Task Force. I think that as we develop, as the RAF is developed, understanding what are the gaps that we're seeing in different companies on the transition plan side will be crucial. And then from there, we can understand on the net zero policy side, what are the targets that need to be set to address these gaps. So yeah, there's so many enabling policies, it would be a bit confusing to list them all, whether that's taxonomy, social investment frameworks, procurement, and so on. But I think that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is to de-silo the conversation. I think there's a bit of this tendency to create task forces, new workforce, new work programs and so on. But at the end, they should all kind of link, and with HLAG recommendations as sort of North Star. So to be more concrete, basically, there's the Just Transition Work Program. There is also the new collective goal for quantified finance goal. And I think it's important that we link these conversations, that we cannot talk about just transition without talking about finance, and similarly, we cannot talk about non-state actors without talking about the enabling policies. So I think there's a risk of, basically a siloing approach, and I think there's an opportunity here really to uphold the H-like criteria again as a North Star.
Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, fully agree on the fact that we need to have this holistic approach. I think also we really need to look at human rights. That is extremely crucial that we look at whether the climate policies that are put in place bring social progress, help to reduce inequality, and do not violate human rights. So I quote, rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of the younger generations, also the right to a healthy environment that has just been recognized as a human right. So really, and we know that this is in the negotiations very difficult to bring forward, but it is essential.
Thank you. Raphael?
Yeah, I think my hope will be more general, because there's much to be said already. For the last 30 years, we have been in the most stabilized geopolitical situation, I think, in all the human history. We doubled the GDP from 47 trillion to 100 trillion today. Did we eradicate poverty? Did we have better equality gender? Did we have? No, not at all. At the same time, we are COP28, so for 30 years we are making this negotiation. So we see the way we are working is not good, just factual. So we need to think different. I really hope that we find other way of thinking, and there is so many things to do. Why we don't make money for infrastructure for the transition? Make money, I mean like monetary creation, and we have like, as we did for the COVID, as we did for when we have problems in the financial market, we do that for the, why we don't, I have Mathieu Lernero from ADEME last week, we had an idea, stop talking about transition, it's not working, talk about zero date. As we did in Europe, we said from 1st January 36, we don't sell a thermal vehicle. So yes, for sure, in 2050, we will not have thermal vehicle. It's another approach. And I really think we need to be creative and think different. It's from a guy who made the company which has the biggest valuation in the world today. It was Steve Jobs who made Apple. So that means think different is also for the company, make business model different, as we said. Adaptation, attenuation is a huge market. We really need to change the rules of the game if we want to solve this problem. That's my hope.
Thank you, Raphael. Last but certainly not least, Rebecca.
Thank you. I guess just 2 points. So the first is the UNFCCC is a state-driven process, and ultimately states do need to be responsible for climate change, but they do that by regulating non-state actors and corporates in their jurisdiction. And the H-Leg report was one of the strongest, I think, examples of what net zero should look like that we've seen. So to the extent that we can capture that in this framework and then provide guidance both to non-state actors but also to the states that will ultimately be responsible for regulating them, I think that's incredibly powerful. And then the other thing to say is also just, I guess, building off what's been said, harnessing the power of non-state actors. So, for example, the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, we counted, and there's around 130 million people around the world that are in jurisdictions that have called for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, but around 80 million of those are actually because they're in sub-national jurisdictions. We have California, Hawaii, big cities like London, Calcutta, and they have incredible market power and just incredible power generally. And so to provide guidance to those actors, to put pressure on their governments from the bottom up, while we also have the top-down party-driven process, I think is also really important and really powerful.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the audience to stay with us till the end. It's almost impossible to summarize everything that's being said. And I only have 1 minute left, and I need to stop in time. But I hope that this panel gave you insight about why integrity and credibility matters in order to truly accelerate on the global goals and everything that we're negotiating here. There is potential to talk to individuals afterwards. I know some need to run to some of the negotiations that are still ongoing, but please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we're always happy to engage. But for now, help me with thanking the panelists for their contributions. Yeah, I think if you could leave your details, then we can make sure they will reach you. Thank you. Yeah. Oh yeah, we need to.